Welcome to the CDP, the Commercial Directors Podcast, where we discuss all things commercial directing, treatments, pitching, problem solving on set, and commercial breakdowns. Now you host Evan Swinehart.
3, 2, 1, talk to me.
All right, everybody, welcome to the show, the CDP. And I have a very awesome guest today, a little bit different than our normal guest, but he's going to be full of insight. We have Scott Pugnetti, who's joining the show. Scott, you're based out of Italy, correct?
I'm based in London now.
London, okay.
I was based out of Italy for a long time, though.
All right, and Scott is the owner of Equals Management. In this episode, it's going to be really good. We're going to talk about bidding, and Scott's going to take us through Equals Management and their kind of unique perspective on the industry. But what I'm really excited about is he's going to break down a director's portfolio and do kind of a live portfolio review. And Scott did one of these for myself. I actually just rewatched it to familiarize myself again with your process. And it's super helpful, and I loved it. I actually took a lot of notes because I'm like, I actually got to apply these now to my portfolio. And you raised some questions that really got me thinking about like how to position myself. But also, like, when you're going through my site, it was a lot of stuff that I'm like already subconsciously kind of like felt about my site anyway. So it was great to kind of like have you say that, because I'm like, okay, I was noticing this and Scott is, so a lot of people probably are. And these are just little tweaks that probably can make my site go a lot further. But Scott, again, welcome to the show. And let's just talk about Equals Management and kind of what is Equals Management and how you started it, why you started, and how you even like got into this industry and this position in the first place.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, I suppose the first place to start is that we operate on what's sort of known as the international model. And when I say the international model, I basically mean almost everywhere outside of the US, because the US model is very distinctive in the way that it operates. So I suppose the simplest distinction is that the role of a sales rep doesn't really exist. You still have the rest of the structure. So the client commissions the agency comes up with a creative sometimes, and they reach out to production companies directly. And then those production companies, anywhere from 2 to 5, will then reach out to people like myself, because the majority of production companies, this isn't true of every market, but in most markets, they won't have a roster. So they will work with freelance directors, or they'll work with either agents or managers. It sort of depends how you prefer to sort of term yourself, who have a roster of directors in exclusive for those territories. So when a director is in exclusive with a company like Equals Management in, let's say, Dubai or in Germany, you're not exclusive to one production company. You're pitching with all of the production companies, because we receive scripts from everyone. Everyone's looking for talent, and everyone's looking for the right director for, that specific project. So in many ways, it's easier for me to tell you where we don't work, because we cover a lot of ground. We do a lot of work all across Asia, so in Vietnam, Thailand, China, India, South Korea is a market that's opening up now, which is really exciting. A lot of work in the Middle East, all across Europe, some parts of Africa as well, the sort of the top belt, Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, Algeria, but also Ivory Coast and Senegal are markets that are really beginning to open up and starting to have budgets that are, it's not about being enticing to directors, but just something that can work, a budget that allows you to fly in international talent. And then over the last 5 years, we've started pushing a lot in the US and pitching directly to production companies, sales reps, agencies, as well as brands, whoever is looking for the right director for that project. So that, in a nutshell, that's sort of how our model works. We are not inventing the wheel here. It's very much how the international model works.
Maybe talk a little bit about the pros of the international market and maybe the cons of the US market.
be careful how much you push me, because I'm likely to rant and rave for a while. Well, I think the pros are certainly that if you are, let's take a US director as an example. If you're pitching in the US, even if you're freelance, you likely have a pool of production companies that reach out to you, maybe a few agencies that like you. But you always get the feeling that you're this small part in this massive market, and it is a massive market. And it can often be hard to find your level in terms of the competition that you're bidding against. What pitching internationally does is it opens you up to new markets where your work might be more appreciated, or it might be more relevant in that particular moment. The international model means that you're not tied to one production company, which ultimately has one sort of stream of relationships and networks. If I look at the production companies I work with in any given territory, there are some that are better in, winning the automotive jobs, some that are better in winning the beauty jobs, the comedy jobs. So being able to pitch with all of them, it just means that you have more opportunities. And it also means that on every single job, particularly if I receive the job from maybe 2 to 3 different production companies, I can make an informed decision on what I think the best path to win that job is, in terms of which production company has the best relationship with the brand, which one has the best relationship with the client, with the agency, who do we have the best relationship with. So you're constantly, there's a lot of strategy that's involved, but you're also trying to, I suppose, matchmake and make sure that you're pairing the right director and that director's personality with the right avenue to success, I suppose. I've always found that the US model is very limiting, and you're not necessarily getting the right team together for the project, just because of the way that the roster model works. Inevitably, we have a roster. We have a roster of directors that are exclusive to us. We're not a production company. I'm not a producer, so we work in a very different way. But even I have to have my back pocket picks, because you get the lifestyle, cat food, VFX heavy comedy job, and or a job with a bear. I know one bear director. There's a guy in Mexico who shot hundreds of bear campaigns. Anything with a bear, he's your guy. Does it make sense for me to represent him in exclusive? No, it would be limiting to him. But when those opportunities come around, it means that I get to sort of reach out and say, like, hey, bear job number 3 of the year came in. Well, I just think that it's a bit more freeing. It also allows you to sort of pick and choose your relationships a little bit. In some territories, it makes sense to be on a roster. And so we work with the director and say, okay, I think we're going to place you on the roster of, a super amazing production company in France, because France is in a market that has a huge amount of board flow where it makes sense to be pitching with everyone. So it allows you to sort of take a bit more control over the strategy and the way that you want to develop your career.
For sure. And one thing I was wondering, since you work all over the world, but you're not a production company. So once, let's say, one of the directors that you put up for a job gets the job, are you guys then out, or are you supporting that director and making sure they're set up for success? Let's say, especially if it's like, okay, let's say there's a job in Vietnam and you have a director from the States, and they've never worked there. So are you setting them up with fixers and things like that? Or is it just kind of like you get them the job and then they're figuring out the rest?
Well, so I have a director who's flying out to Vietnam today, actually, and it's his first job in Vietnam. Now, I'm not going to be on the job. No one from Equals is going to be on the job. He is going to be greeted at the airport by the production company. The production company are, responsible for him, which is not the right word, but they will be looking after him. Now, we have to make a a decision when we're pitching to make sure that we're pitching directors with production companies that we trust, that we know look after directors. Obviously, we get new production companies coming up all the time, so there is an element of trial and error. In this case, we know this production company. We worked with them for 10, 13 years. We know how things are going to go. But in all honesty, there are elements of my job which I can't believe directors trust me, because I send them a script from a faraway country. They accept the job books, and then they just get on a plane. I mean, there's elements of like human trafficking to my job. If directors didn't have so much trust in me, the whole thing would fall apart. But that's a big part of the job is building and growing that trust and earning that trust, but also making sure that we're not putting directors in situations where they won't be looked after. Another perfect example is we have a director in Kiev right now. This is, I think, the ninth director we've sent to Kiev since the war started. I would not put them in that situation if they weren't with a production company that I know would put their well-being or the director's well-being first. And these are, fantastic people that we've worked with for the last 10 years. And yeah, they will have to brief them on bomb shelters and on what happens if there's an attack. But that's, part of the responsibility of their job, as much as mine in connecting them.
The other question I had is, and I'm curious what the difference is, or if you have any numbers around this, is like what is the competition like in more of your model versus the U.S.? So, I was talking to a director a little bit ago, a director who focused on a lot of car work, and they said they saw in 1 year, I think they saw like 300 boards. They got put up for 3 of them, or like triple bid on 3 of them, and one or 0 of them. I can't remember, but the numbers were insane. And I see that a lot too, where there's like so many boards, and then you start to think of like, okay, like how many directors am I going up against for this one job, right? And you start to just do the numbers in your head, and you're like, I might be up against 100+ directors for this one job. So it's like, okay, agency reaches out to all their reps. Reps are, let's just say there's 10 reps they're reaching out to, or even 5, and then each production company is putting up like 2 directors. The numbers seem very slim to me, and it seems like the top of the top are the ones who are just getting those jobs.
I think, unfortunately, what we started seeing in some territories, let's say the bad habits of some territories, are now international. There's not a market that doesn't have the bad things that used to happen in Russia then spread somewhere else. But then at the same time, the bad things that were happening in Dubai spread elsewhere. And now we're in a situation in the industry where globally, all the, frankly, the bullshit of the industry is rife everywhere. In terms of the numbers, I mean, it depends on the job. There are some jobs where you just sort of get a feeling and and I'm sure you've received jobs like this as well, where you just know, okay, this is a small pool. This is it's not going out through the usual channels. But I would say that on the majority of jobs, I mean, I'm lucky in my position because pitching with, everyone from sales reps to production companies, agencies, brands, I get to see the full picture, let's say. I'm also very lucky because I often get copied on emails I shouldn't be seeing. And people are very bad at CCing when they should be BCCing. And so what that means is, I've seen emails from agencies in the US go out where there's literally 60 reps that are supposed to be blind copied. And they're just, hey, got this one for you. It's not personalized at all. Those jobs, I think, frankly, are a total waste of time because it's so unlikely. Even if you were Ridley Scott, even if you were, Paul Thomas Anderson, it doesn't matter because those jobs don't happen. Those jobs don't actually ever get to being on screen. those jobs, in my mind, are an exercise in creativity harvesting and in trying to find, well, we have this idea, we're not really sure about it, let's send it out and let's see what sort of feedback we get and see what directors are interested, and if they like it, we can get them to bid on it. And if we see something in the treatments that we really like, we might then show it to the client. But until then, I think we'll just sort of keep it internal and pretend it's a real bid. And, bidding on unapproved creative is a really serious issue that unfortunately is extremely rife across the industry. So the competition internationally is not any better than it is in the US. In fact, in some ways, it's likely worse because you're literally competing against the entire world. You've also got the question of local directors versus international directors. I think that having pitched in the US for a while now, I think there's a lot less bullshit internationally, sadly. There's a lot less bureaucracy, but that's probably not something that you have to come up against. I just feel like we're in a moment in the industry where there's a lot of confusion as to what is everyone's job and how does that job benefit the actual creative process. We're seeing half-baked creative coming over where they're telling us we want the director's vision on this. And it's like, well, no, bullshit. You want the director to write it for you. You want the director to come up with a concept for you. And the director's not being compensated for that. And they're not being compensated for their time, for their work, for their creative output. So I think that despite being very optimistic and despite genuinely still believing that there is enough work for everyone, and the sort of solution to that is making sure that you're pitching in the right pools and that you're pitching with people that respect you and people that are going to genuinely actually watch the portfolio, which is another issue. But I think it's a moment where, as directors that directors need to communicate, gather together, and sort of say, well, we don't want to do this anymore. We don't want to pitch in this model, and we don't want to work for free because it's actively pushing directors and pushing great creative talent out of the industry.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. So let's talk about that then. Let's talk about, pitch reform and bidding. Because again, you guys and I say you guys over in Europe have started working on pitch reform and setting up some boundaries with agencies on the triple bid. So can you kind of take us through what those are, what that looks like, and why it's a positive for the industry?
Well, so there's a few different models, and in truth, this is something that is the result of 6+ years of discussions, and so it's not something that happens overnight. The success story is Germany. They have a directors union, which is, from an American perspective, more like a directors association, which is just a collection of all the commercial directors in Germany. Their name is Direct, DRCT. I would strongly encourage you to follow them on their socials. What they did was exactly what I was saying earlier. They got together, they communicated, and they said, these are the problems that we're facing. These are, the lack of transparency in the bidding process, bidding on unapproved creative, and a lack of compensation for the time and effort that all of this bidding takes. Our job is essentially bidding. Our job isn't actually directing anymore. And so what they did was they brought this to the German Producers Association, and they had extremely constructive discussions saying to them, look, more and more directors are jaded. More and more directors are leaving this industry because it's just not tenable in 2025 to be doing this and to constantly be pitching and losing jobs. And it's not about they weren't good enough or whatever, but they're like I said earlier, they're just providing creative output for no return. And so what Direct and the German Producers Association did was they came up with a pitch cost share model, which is essentially that on depending on the scale of the budget, each director that is asked to bid would be compensated, relative to whatever the budget is. And that's true for German directors as much as it is for international directors bidding in Germany. So on any sort of pitch. They took this to the agencies, they took this to the brands, and they just had an open and frank discussion about it. And, through a lot of discussion, they were able to implement this. There are still, I think at the time, there are 3 clients that I know of that won't adhere to it, and they're cocks. They're absolute, they're nobody likes them. But what it means is that in 2024, only 13.5% of pitches went uncompensated, which means that the vast majority of times directors were paid, anywhere from the equivalent of $500 to $2,000, $3,000, just for being chosen to bid, working on the treatment. And by the way, that isn't money that is paying for an image researcher or a writer or whatever. That is their money for their time, their work, and their effort, on top of that. So in what happens, and what the sort of initial suggestion behind this was that production companies are also paying, enormous fees, particularly in the US, for treatments. And it's not fair on the production companies either, who are often being treated like banks. And so what the pitch cost share model does is it puts those costs into the winning budget. And so they are factored in from the beginning, that any budget, whatever you end up budgeting it at, includes these costs. And so these costs are, shared, and everyone knows, what it's going to cost to pitch. In Spain, they had a different approach. The Directors Union brought it to the Producers Association, who were not eager to get into these discussions. And they said, this is a director's problem. And so the directors went on strike. And they refused to write treatments until they were compensated for it. And what that did is it changed the ecosystem. It meant that the production companies that were happy to get involved and were happy to talk about compensation received the best talent. And the production companies that weren't, well, no one wanted to bid with them anymore, because they weren't part of a fair process. And so I think that the lessons to sort of take from that are, directors need to talk. That's probably the greatest change that I've seen in I've been doing this for 13 years now. It used to be that directors would never, ever talk to each other. Now WhatsApp groups, communities are popping up. And that urge to communicate and to share, the issues that directors face has, been a massive, massive change. It's massively benefited, the way that we work as a director-led company, but also, the way that directors continue to work internationally.
It's amazing that, Germany being the great case study there, was able to get that through. Cause I still have so much, I just don't feel optimistic around that in the States, There's such a scarcity mentality, I feel like, here, or at least just in the industry of, almost like the agencies hold all the power, or the people at the work, right? And there's a fear of pissing them off almost, or just being they'll just go with somebody else. You know what I mean? If someone's being a headache, they'll just go with somebody else. So it's kind of how do you kind of tackle that,
But that's a position that we've been placed in by those, the powers, essentially. And, not to wave my little red book about, but, it's easy for the people in the industry with a salary tell the people without one how to work. and it's just not fair. And I will say that in the US, there's certainly an appetite, but the Alliance of Independent Reps, AIR, and their president, Ann Asprodaites, who's a wonderful person, she has been pushing extremely hard on this, and she's been bringing this to AICP, and she has been, and together we've had so many discussions on this. She's spoken with the German Producers Association. She's spoken to absolutely everyone internationally that I've introduced her to. And she is really pushing for this change because it's not fair. And I think the number one issue that I see in a lot of international markets as well as the US is that it's not directors leading this charge. It's sales reps and it's managers or agents like myself. And we don't really benefit from it. We benefit from it in having directors that are happier, that are more comfortable, and feel like they're part of a fair process. But financially, there's no benefit. And so I would really urge directors to reach out and to me, but also to AIR and to these communities, and to really try and push that change.
For sure. And pushing that change, you kind of like touched on briefly at the very beginning, but I want you to talk a little bit more about like what that reform should look like. So obviously it's getting paid and not, look at thumbs up, not bidding on unapproved creative. But then the other thing you mentioned was, I think you talked about, was like knowing who you were bidding against too, Yeah,
absolutely. I think that, if we look at, so the three sort of key things of pitch reform are transparency, not bidding on unapproved creative, and pitched a pay to pitch. Now, not bidding on unapproved creative is a bad business practice, and it's something that can change tomorrow for free. It doesn't cost anyone anything. And the same is true with transparency. And this always differs, country by country, but not knowing who you're bidding against, not knowing what the final budget is, or the working budget is, not knowing how many directors you're bidding against, not knowing who, just everyone that's involved in the bidding process. Again, it's just a bit bad business practice, and it's something that can change for free. And the truth is, if you're not being told that, it's because they're not respecting the, let's say, general rules of the industry of 3 bidders and no more. We talk about the number of directors involved in any given pitch. I know that in a lot of territories, and certainly, we used to work in Russia before the war. We pulled out. We didn't want to. Essentially, we didn't want to pay into the war coffer, right? And so, but before then, it was very, very normal to get CC'd again into the wrong email and see that production companies were presenting, 25 options to the agency, and that agency was then getting back with a short list of 10, 12 directors, and they were doing, maybe calls with 6 to 8 of them. And then they were saying, well, these people haven't asked us for a call, so let's just get them to do the treatment because they're not pushing us. Number one thing you have to do is always make sure that you're asking for a creative call with the agency, because if they're at least wasting their time on a call, it means that there's a small possibility that you're in, the actual running. It might not be the first pick, but if they didn't consider you, they wouldn't even get on the call, right? But that amount of bidders is, it happens in the US as well. I'd be very surprised if there weren't a growing majority of pitches where you're bidding against, 5, 6 directors easy. And so that transparency benefits the other side only by concealing, the bad practices that they know directors would get pissed off about. And so it's really clear that, and by the way, doing all of this, in my mind, leads to a more competitive market. It leads to directors who see, okay, I'm bidding against my usual rival, and I know that guy or that director, their work is typically done in this way. So I'm going to make sure that my treatment is the complete opposite of that. I'm going to go totally off the rails. I'm going to do something that is very personal, that is, really puts us in a position where it's like this way or that way, right? And if you see that they've brought someone new in, someone that you're not usually bidding against, it allows you to get a slight understanding of, okay, well, what is it that the agency are looking for here? And how can I best answer what that director has in their portfolio that I don't? How can I cover those gaps? And how can I make sure that my treatment is raising to that level? Equally, I've always recommended getting an enemy. I think that having a nemesis in the industry is a wonderful thing. Having someone that you are determined to beat at every sort of corner. I mean it in a friendly sense, but I think it just drives better competition, because you know the rules of the game, you know who you're up against, and you know what tools in your arsenal you need to bring out to win.
I listen to a lot of podcasts, and not all just in the industry, but I was listening to this like entrepreneur podcast, and this woman just said something the other day that like really stood out to me, and I was just like laughing, because she basically invests and buys small businesses, and she was talking about like what businesses to buy, what businesses to not buy, and she was talking about consulting and how she would never buy a consulting firm, and she said, I'll never buy a business where you have to do an RFP to get the work, because she's like, she's like, I don't buy businesses that you have to do free work, and I'm like, oh my God, that's exactly what we do. And she was just like, that's bad business. So it just kind of made me laugh, and it was just the other day, so I was excited, because I'm like, well, this is exactly what we're gonna be talking about. And it kind of starts to make me wonder, is like, is the bid even necessary? Because sometimes too, like, I just had a pitch too where it was actually just a double bid, but I definitely felt a little bit of the sacrificial lamb. Like, they had already worked with the director on the previous campaign, and it felt like it was like just they had to do their due diligence, even though they probably were going to go with this director. So sometimes I'm like, if you know who you want to work with, and lots of times you're already just picking off of what's on somebody's reel. Like you said, okay, there's the bear guy. If someone has bears on their reel, they're probably going to win that job. So it's like, is the bid even necessary?
But I mean, that's bad business as well, because if you lose this job and you feel like you're the sacrificial lamb, how likely are you going to be bidding on the next job? How likely are you going to say like, well, actually, I'm a bit busy, and so they're limiting their own pool there. Whereas if you look at, you get into the bid, you see, oh, okay, I'm up against, the incumbent. But they value my time. They're paying me my, $500, whatever it is, right? They're not asking me to work on the treatment over the weekend. Okay, well, it's, I don't think I'm going to win this one, but it's work. I've been compensated for my work, and so I'm happy to be involved. And maybe I'll throw out a curveball and see if I can snag it, try something a bit different. But at least your time would be valued, and I don't think directors are asking for a huge amount for this to matter.
Right. Well, and I don't mind bidding too, because even if I know I'm not going to get the job, I'm like, hey, this is great practice for myself. And I always look to improve. And if I lose a bid, I always ask, what didn't I do? What could I have done better? And it's always something too that they do point out that I'm like, ah, shit, I didn't even think about that. Lots of times it's like the one I lost to the incumbent, and I asked, okay, so what did I not do? What could I have done better? And they said, the creative director asked you a question about the 15s, and I kind of just threw the 15s away. To be honest, I hadn't even thought about them. I was so focused on the hero, and they said the other director had some really good ideas for the 15, and I'm like, damn, because because I just thought that was just such a little question, and I was just kind of like, oh, I just pretty much gave like a top level answer, but kind of threw away that question. And it's what they said lost me the job, which I thought was super interesting. Yeah, so I think there's always value in that, and I do think it gives you an opportunity to leave a mark in their mind and come back to you for another pitch, which I've had. Like I've had a really good pitch where I lost, and then they came back to me and were like, "We loved your treatment on the last job. We'd like to have you pitch again." And then I won that one. So I don't think it's, it's a lot of work, but I do think there is value in it at times. But I definitely think there should be reform, and we absolutely should be paid for the work we do, because I do think it would produce better work all around. But one thing I wanted to get back to kind of like equals management was, okay, let's say you're a director and you're looking to go international and try to get more international work. What's the best way to go about that?
I know some directors love the networking side of things, right? And they love going to events. They love, so if you go to Cannes Lions, for example, you're going to meet, more production companies that you could ever imagine, or more agencies and more brands. Cyclope, which is next week in Berlin. These are all great events for meeting people in the industry. And some directors love that sort of hunting down production companies and spreadsheets and whatever. If that's not you, the best thing you can do in my mind is find a manager or an agent. I'm slightly biased in that, but I think that if I try to look at it from the perspective of a director, particularly again, if we use this American example, pitching in countries that you don't know, pitching with production companies that you don't know, pitching, I would say the majority of directors that don't have manager and agent do most jobs without a contract or without a form of deal memo. I think it's one thing doing that in certain countries, but, you never know what's going to happen. I mean, thankfully, we've never had any payment issues. Is that because we've always had contracts? Is that because we always work with people we, trust and know? I don't know. I think that it's certainly a risky game. So, I mean, I would say that the first thing to do is just, research managers, agents, reach out to them, just have a conversation. I mean, honestly, most of my competition are really lovely and would be very happy, even just to enlighten directors on, oh, well, this is how it works internationally, and this is what it's like shooting in Vietnam, and this is what it's like in Germany. Just because, we all sort of feel like we're part of the same process, and we're, definitely in industry terms at the bottom of the food chain. So I think having a guide is always beneficial. Having a trusted partner, and that's what it ends up being, right? The relationships that I have with directors it starts off as a guide, and it starts off that way, but then it just ends up becoming a trusting partnership, and then hopefully it blossoms into a friendship.
One of the things you do when you're working with directors is you do these portfolio reviews and kind of go over their work, look at their site, look how they're positioning themselves, branding themselves. So today we're going to actually do a live portfolio review. But maybe before we start that, maybe just talk about like that process and what maybe kind of like started you doing this type of work, and what are kind of the benefits?
I get reached out to quite often by directors, and I always try to answer and sort of give feedback. I had recently an Argentinian dancer who danced for like Beyonce and is based in Dubai send me like an outreach email and say like, oh, I'd love to be represented by you. Now, we don't represent dancers, but her outreach email was really like messy. It was just full of images in the email. I knew they wouldn't load correctly for certain inboxes, and the information was just all over the place. And I don't know. I suppose I do this a lot, so I find it quite easy to compile lots of information in a sort of concise way. And I wrote back saying, look, we don't represent dancers. Congratulations on working with Beyonce. However, if you're reaching out, if you're doing all this outreach, which I imagine you're doing, this is the way you should be doing it. And I suppose it's just, look, if I could represent every director, I absolutely would. I really have like a love for working with directors. We're blessed that we're able to look after so many of them because of the way that we work. But the truth is we can't. But I've always felt that instead of gatekeeping information, if we can just give you that next sort of push in the right direction and say, look, our roster is full, or we can't sign anyone right now. Things are really difficult. I mean, during COVID, we had tons of people reaching out, and I said, look, now is not the time to sign an exclusive deal with anyone, even with the best agent in the world, because there's no possibility of work. We don't know what the industry is going to look like. And so that's why I decided to make a part of the website where directors could submit their work, and I would slowly get back to them. And I say slowly only because the list is wide. I've started now. I do this on a Sunday. I'll go through and I'll record. Also because what I'm doing is I'm recording a 15-20 minute video going over the work, and then I send it out. And it takes a little while to prepare, but it's something that I love doing, and I feel it keeps me sharp as well. Looking at different work and trying to analyze, what changes I would make. But it's very rarely a problem with the actual work. If a director reaches out to me, it's unlikely that they are at the stage where the work isn't there. It's usually just an issue with positioning, an issue with design or portfolio, having too many, too few, maybe the wrong sort of pieces in the wrong order, not having a clear direction. And that's what working with a manager and agent can help you, or what working with a great producer can help you with.
Yeah, do you have, like, I don't want to say mistakes, but maybe what are the most like common missteps you're kind of seeing?
Well, so the number one thing is not having a website, just having a Vimeo page. I get so sad thinking about this because I loved Vimeo. Vimeo was such a wonderful website, and the changes they continue to make are just incomprehensible. And so we've sadly, left it. But what I find is directors only having a Vimeo portfolio, not particularly taking care of it, maybe not looking after their titles, their thumbnails, whatever. I'm not so concerned about that, honestly. But what Vimeo doesn't allow you to do is tailor your work in the way you want it to be seen. You can do little showcases and stuff, but it doesn't really work so well. There's no space really for a bio. It ends up going under see more. Really, as a director, what you need to have is a website that is, the museum of Evan, or the museum of, whoever. It's a place that can display your personality as much as it can, your work. And this is still a people business. And I think agencies and producers and, brands want to know that they're hiring a full person and not just, a machine.
Well, let's go ahead and do the review here. If you want to share.
Yeah, let me open this up. Okay.
All right. So, do you know Adrian, or did he just reach out to you?
So Adrian reached out to me on Sunday, which was lucky, because that's the day that I did the reviews, and he sent me, a very nice message and a link. And so what he has here is a website, which is actually essentially a Vimeo showcase with its own URL. So the first thing for me is, and having spoken to him and having got his blessing to share his work on the podcast, his train of thought is right. He's thinking, I need to find a way to showcase my work in a way where clicking and seeing my work and seeing the next piece of work is as easy as possible. And that is absolutely spot on. That is very true. If you start making your own website and you make it really clunky and you have to click in and you have to click out and you have to click in and you have to click out, all of this, it becomes a bit laborious, and you've got to hope that someone is going to invest the time in you. Now, the truth is, if someone's on your website, they are actually more likely to spend a bit of time there, more so than they would be if they're seeing, a portfolio sent through for a specific pitch. And so that's why I call it the sort of the museum of you, because you've sort of got to have a little bit of, an offering, right? So again, like I said, there is nothing wrong with the work. Adrian has a really fantastic portfolio. He's got some really cool, interesting work. He's sort of, he's got a really sort of interesting blend of storytelling with CGI, AI, and virtual production. And if I'm reading here in his bio, and this bio is like this because Vimeo doesn't allow for a fuller bio, this is sort of all I'm getting. Oh, and another actually big issue that I should point out is a lot of directors don't have their own profile picture. And so they sort of exist as this anonymous being. Again, this is a people business. So, my first recommendation is always positioning, always looking at, what are you telling about yourself? How can you have your work sell itself, through the portfolio, but also through, the whole, through your positioning. But also this is really important from an SEO and more recently from a ChatGPT perspective, because those keywords and the way that you talk about yourself has to be able to translate across, across Google and across ChatGPT, because that is how a lot of people are being found. I could talk for hours about how, we're taste curators and we help, agencies find the right talent. But, I think a lot of agencies are using ChatGPT. Who are the best lifestyle and sports directors in Chicago? And I think we're foolish if we don't try to reverse engineer, how do I make sure I'm on that list? And so that's why a bio that is, I have a stupid saying of like 50% storytelling, 50% marketing, is really essential, because you wanted to showcase, yes, Adrian is a director who does dynamic storytelling. He has transitions. He does AI, which is really important, virtual production, CGI. You want a bio that covers all of that is serving that marketing side. But also, I want to know who he is as a person. Comedy directors that don't have funny bios drive me insane. The amount of comedy directors that have the driest, most boring Wikipedia. Mark is from Texas, and then he did this, and then he won this award. Oh my God, this is like your opportunity to really to sell yourself, and it's hard. I'm not. Don't get me wrong. It is extremely hard writing about yourself in the third person or even in the first person, and it's hard to be funny on a website. And the truth is, you're directors. You're not web designers, and unfortunately, this has become a part of the job. Some directors are fortunate enough they can afford to hire a web team to do their site and whatever. But even so, positioning, bio, making sure that it's accessible and that it all sort of works is really important. Having your contact details, absolutely crucial. Listing if you have agents and what territories they cover, if you're rep by a production company. But I think one of the issues with Adrian's website, again, is not the quality of the work, but more the quantity. Right now he has 28 videos on what is essentially the only page, but the home page of his of his work, and it's not necessarily an issue with a number. There isn't like a special number. I think with the layout, 8 would be great, just because it's a nice, it looks very nice. You could potentially even go with 12. 3 rows of 4. I think that works fine. He has very diverse sort of work, so you could cover a lot of different things. The problem with 28 videos is when you start getting to the bottom, and it stops being the most recent, the freshest, the most relevant work. And what you don't want is someone to get down to that bottom side of it and start understanding and start, pushing them away from the sale, essentially. Because inevitably, the older work, the work that you did on smaller budgets is not going to match the more recent work. So try to keep that attention span short, sweet, get them to say, wow, this director's got really exciting, fresh work. He told me that he's got 5 new pieces coming out. So essentially, a lot of this third row, provided that those 5 pieces are worthy of being in that sort of front row, those would be pushed down, and everything else below it should go realistically.
Yeah, that was a question I did have, and you kind of hit on it, but like that, because that is one thing I struggle with too, is like, I sometimes find it hard to judge your own work, and I've been trying to kind of like narrow in on okay, what are, let's say like the 5 to 10 pieces that really tell who I am, are my best work, and position myself as like, this type of director. But I struggle with being like, because I'm attached to certain pieces, or I like a piece that maybe doesn't resonate with other people. So I'm just curious if you, like you talked about being like kind of your newer work or fresher work, or maybe something that has more of the production value, but are there any other tips when you're that close to the work to kind of help eliminate it?
I mean, certainly getting a second pair of eyes on it is huge. There are so many jobs that the directors I work with will do and will share with me, and I will get so frustrated that they've never shared it with me, because they're jobs that sell, and they sell easily, and they convey trust in, this is a director who can do this, or this is a director who can do that, very quickly. But from a director's point of view, they're not the most exciting, they're not the most, and that balance becomes very difficult on a website, because it's not a specific pitch. On a specific pitch, it becomes a lot easier, because you're targeting a certain, a certain ask. And so on every pitch, or on every bid, we will constantly be shifting the reels, and, what about a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and changing the order and whatever. On your website, you can't really allow for that. And so that decision of those, 5 to 10 pieces becomes a lot harder. There was to be honest, a lot of what I learned about portfolios, I learned from a director that we worked with called Misko Iho, who's a wonderful director in LA. A lovely, lovely man. And he was really dogmatic about his portfolio. He had 10 films on his website. He's changed it now, which makes me laugh, but he had 10 films on his website, and he wouldn't bid on a job unless he thought that if he won that job, that would knock one of the other pieces off. And so what that did was it made him really consider the balance. Okay, well, what am I going to take off? I'm going to take this job here, but that job has really good examples of costume, and I really want to be moving more costume onto the work. Okay, well, what if I took this one off? That's my only real good example of comedy. Am I moving into comedy? Am I sort of being honest in that? Maybe not. Maybe that's something that could go. And what that does is it allows you to really have a concept of your portfolio as a living, breathing thing that is evolving, and that then helps you, almost what we try to do with control, which is, trying to empower directors and trying to think about what the next 5 years look like, and trying to plan, the next 5 years of your career. That evolution and that thought of, well, right now my work is here, but I really want to move it more, heavier CGI or more transitions, less transitions, whatever it is, right? Having that mentality and sort of being a bit dogmatic about your portfolio and adding those restraints to yourself, I think often can help you really be a bit more objective about what you're cutting and what you're leaving.
For sure. And one other thing I noticed with Adrian's portfolio, and I don't know if this is a big deal or not, but it's kind of sometimes the first thing I look for on sites. I actually do this a ton when I'm casting people, is because like I'll get their portfolio, I then look at their social and their Instagram, because lots of times I feel like I can get to know like who they are a little bit better, and kind of get a sense of them. And so and also like I wanted to follow Adrian, right? And I couldn't follow him because I didn't see his Instagram, but I'm wondering like how important having their social is on the site. And then the second part of that is like what should their social look like? Should it only be work, or should it be a little bit of more of like just their personal life as well on there?
I think that I think that really depends. And it depends what you're comfortable with. First of all, I know a lot of directors have private Instagram pages, and they don't really want the whole industry following them, and I think that that's fair enough. I think, unfortunately, well, I don't know if unfortunately is right, but I think that you have to be able to present a full picture of yourself. And if you have something about you that is, particularly interesting or that is particularly humorous, I could think of two good examples. A director that we work with, Mike Fagan, his Instagram is hilarious. He's constantly posting stuff that, he doesn't have to sell to me. He's already on the roster. But if I was a creative director, it just makes me like him that bit more, because his stuff is really relatable and funny and different. Other directors, Parker Schmidt, who was on the podcast, he has such a beautiful Instagram, the aesthetics, everything. It gives you a really good idea of his taste. There was a director that I was I was doing the coaching course that we do with, and he had Chris Thomas. He had a section of his portfolio, a section of his website rather, that was dedicated to storm chasing, and he was unsure as to whether he should keep that. And I urged him to not only keep it, but to like go heavy on that in his on his social presence, because it's interesting, because it makes him a full person. It makes him someone that, if I was shortlisting him and I was sent his website and I saw like, oh, hang on, there's all these amazing pictures and videos of him like chasing chasing tornadoes and all of this. I would find that so fascinating, and I would sort of be like, okay, forget the creative. Let's really get in here on these storms. How dangerous is it? And I think that's so wonderful. I had a director ask me the other day if one of our directors asked him if he's very into yoga, and he said, should I be sharing that on my Instagram? I feel like I want to, but is that distracting from me as a director? And I think no. I think it's, maybe you can tie it in. How does this practice help you, as you, bid and as you direct? But it just makes you a fuller, more real person. There is nothing I hate more than meeting a director and all they can talk to me is about directing. It drives me crazy. They're so boring. Be a full person. Be a real person. There's so much more to life than this.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's like you said, it's a relationship business, right? And you want to be memorable, and sometimes it's more than just the work, right? Like the storm chasing one is a great thing. And if you're like you're thinking about two directors, you're like be like the Storm Chaser guy, like because that like makes him stand out, and you can be like maybe their work was exactly the same, but you're like, if I'm gonna hang out with somebody on set for 3 days, I'd rather hang out with this guy.
Exactly. I mean, this is it. You are booking a person that you're going to be spending a lot of time with. You might as well book someone that's cool to hang out with.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, back to Adrian here. Like, what about the design of his website, and how important is design from kind of a look and feel? Again, like you said, this is hard because a lot of directors aren't. Maybe they're more like writers versus visual directors. They're not graphic designers. They're not web designers. But what should the design of the website look like, or the portfolio?
I think it can be really simple. I think that if you went as there's a director that I'm currently doing the course with, Alfredo Vidal. His website is very simple, but it's elegant. It's sort of beautiful. Kim Gehrig's website is a fantastic example of so much of what I sort of try to push in positioning. I hope she never changes her website because I reference it daily. But it's simple. It's really beautiful and elegant. If your website was literally a white background, always try to push for lighter tones than darker tones. I don't know why, but it sells better. I can't explain why. But if you just had a white backdrop with, 3 rows of 3, 3 rows of 4, or, whatever it is that you're trying to present, and you had, and that section was called work, and you had a section that was about, and it had a bio that had 50% storytelling, 50% marketing. You had a context section that had all of your information. That would be it. That would be plenty. That would be fine. I think for the vast majority of directors, that would be a really great base to sort of build from. If your work is, there's a director that we work with called Mindro, and he recently sent me his updated website, and it is bonkers. Like, it is like exciting. It's really like, and that's his work. That's what his work is, right? So his website is a reflection of him. If you went to the museum of bonkers CGI transition work and you walked in and it was the driest place in the world, it wouldn't work, right? So I think if you're able to have the work be reflective, have the website be reflective of your work, then that's wonderful. If you have a dreamlike aesthetic, is there something that you can bring into there? If your work is based on taste, can you make it really beautifully done? So I think it can certainly help, and it can certainly elevate, but I would still advocate for, you use a template. Yeah, I use Wix. Wix has plenty of amazing templates. Just use something like that and just get started and just have that as your base. The most important thing is just getting started. Get it all up there, and then after that, you can build. You are going to be tinkering with it throughout your career, but just get it started, get the base done really simply, and then work from there.
Well, what I think simplicity allows is also very simple user experience too.
Yeah,
because you were talking about that kind of bonkers website. I have this DP. He listens to this podcast. I absolutely love him so much. He's my favorite human. But the first time he reached out to me, his website, I could not figure out even how to work. And I'm like, where is the work? And it was very hard to use. And so I didn't really want to work with him. And then I saw on his social, he posted some frames from a feature film he had shot, and they were beautiful. And so it made me go back and try to refine his work on that website. But the first initial experience on the website was I was like, what the hell? What am I looking at? Who is this person? And it kind of turned me off. But then it was his socials later turned me back on, and thank God it did, because I use them all the time. Yeah. Well, so is there anything else that you would like to kind of just go over with Adrian's portfolio, or just kind of like positioning in general?
Well, I think that one of the things you always have to consider when you're shooting internationally is that you are likely going to be shooting in a different language. And so if you're shooting in France, the work is going to be French. If you're shooting in Dubai, it's going to be in Arabic, sometimes in English as well. But so you have to think about how that is then going to live on your website. And so as soon as possible after a job is done, having it subtitled, having it dubbed, having it whatever, English is the dominant language of the industry. It sells everywhere. So, for example, Adrian's first piece is, and rightly is the crown jewel of his portfolio because of the work, but also it's dubbed in English. It's shortlisted for the Berlin Commercial Awards, and so it acts as that that inviting piece that sort of sets the tone, right? But his next few pieces are in Polish, which is, he's a Polish director. So that has the potential, certainly from an American perspective, from a British perspective, and certain other territories internationally, to start to switch off a little bit and to start to sort of change the focus. So this is something that's maybe more directed to international directors, is try to always consider that if it's something that you're putting on the portfolio, try to finish it as soon as possible, but later on, it gets very difficult to add that sort of work. I know that Adrian is adding, like I said, these 5 new pieces, which I think are all dubbed or have an English VO. That's fantastic. And again, then you will start getting into this this tinkering of, what do I position where, right?
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because when I was reviewing the portfolio, that's one thing I noticed. Like, the work is beautiful and awesome, and I loved the visuals, but I couldn't follow the story because there was no dubbing or like subtitles on these.
And if we think back about this job that my director is flying out to shoot in Vietnam, that is going to be a Vietnamese piece, and it will exist exclusively in Vietnamese. Now, if it has if it's VO only, that's an easy fix. That's no problem at all. But if it's not, if it's heavy on dialogue, then you have to look at subtitling. Dubbing is complicated, doesn't always look great, honestly. So subtitling is fine. Another really great thing, actually, that Adrian has done is made everything downloadable directly from his site. That is, like, for me or anyone in my position or a producer, that is the number one gift you can do, is just make your work really accessible to download and to repurpose, because you don't know how anyone's gonna, like, we put everything in through our Simian and then we build the portfolios there. So that is a massive help. More generally speaking, if you have a Dropbox or a WeTransfer, or however you host your work, making sure that you have that work in good resolution, but preferably not 300, 400 megabyte files. That's one of the things that's really going to speed things up and make you stand out more in the pitch, just because the producer will have had more time to work on your work. If the work is too big, too bulky, and it takes too long, I think there's a good chance that you're going to end up on the cutting room floor. Just because they'll have found someone else who got the work to them faster, and they'll say, like, well, between these two, let's just go with this.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And this is shifting away from the portfolio, but I think we're about time anyway. But that I've had this a lot, and this is actually really interesting to me, is when I've had people reach out to me who are like, hey, we've got these boards, we want to put you up for it. And I'm like, okay, yeah, great. I haven't seen this. I'd love to. But recently I've had a lot of them be like, here are the boards. What spots should we put of yours? And they're almost having me pick the work that goes to the boards or the concept. And I'm just curious your opinion of that, because I don't mind, but I'm also like, I would love maybe more of a conversation, dialogue, and we should work together and pick those. Or I feel like you know it better than me, because you've had the talks with either the creative team or the rep, where I'm just kind of guessing, but it's like the creative call. Like there's always little things you pick up on that you're like, oh, I want to put this in my treatment. And I would assume it's the same when you talk to these reps. Maybe not, maybe it's just an email and you're just like, hey, like you might know better than me, but I'm just curious what your take is on that.
I think unfortunately there's a massive amount of laziness in the industry. I think a lot of people don't want to do the work, and the flip side of that is I think there's also a lot of people who are under intense pressure and are constantly being pushed into an unbelievable sort of like turnarounds, and so they don't have the time to manage everything. So I think in an ideal scenario, you are speaking with the producer, you are talking about like, okay, these are my top 10 picks. Out of these, what are the 4 or 5 that really work for this? Because ultimately, when you talk about a portfolio, when we're sending it over, typically it's 4 to 5 pieces, and those 4 to 5 pieces have to share a common thread, and they have to respond to the brief in the best way possible. And that can even be through structure. If we're pitching on a 30, I want to have as many 30s in there as possible. If we're pitching on a 15, similar. So going back to what we were talking about, about the bidding process, and these scripts that are sent out to like hundreds of people and all of that. Unfortunately, what that's meant is that a big part of my job now is acting as a filter and trying to make sure that we're pitching on the opportunities that make the most sense, and that we're following up on the leads, and we're pushing the relationships and trying to develop the relationships with the people that are going to respect our and the director's time the most. It's not easy, but that's it's sadly become a big part of it, because the truth is, a lot of the portfolios that get sent out, aren't being watched, aren't being viewed all the way through, or sort of like 2-3, we have tracking on Simeon. You see like, watched it for 2 seconds and they say like, no, it's not quite right. It's like, well, what the fuck do you know? Like, so I think that what that filtering does though, and this is a tool that directors can do as well, is if you are bidding on projects and the producer is reaching out and saying, hey, I think that what would be really great for this would be that Nike piece you did, or this, or that. But what do you think? And you have that open conversation. That is a relationship you should be really pushing. And that is a relationship you should be investing your time in. The other ones, maybe even the ones that are bigger production companies that feel really exciting and feel like, whatever, try to evaluate if they're really respecting your time, really respecting your process, and are really sort of, if they have your best interests at heart. Because, a lot of it is just like a big meat churner. So if you have someone that is willing to go through the work with you and talk it through and collaborate, then that's a person that is genuinely invested in the creative industry.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I really like, is I had that recently where they were like, hey, we want to put you up for this. They sent me the Simeon, here it is. And then they're like, let us know if you want to add anything or any thoughts. And it was for like a walk and talk type of commercial. And I had some stuff that wasn't on my website, but I was like, it was almost the script to a T, And so I was like, well, here's this too. And they're like, oh yeah, this is exactly the job.
There's 2 sides of it. No one will know your work as well as you will. And hopefully no one will know how to sell your work as well as they will. and those two sides have to sort of marry and meet. Because, I, as much as, even with the directors I've had the longest relationships with, as much as I feel like I know their work inside and out, I wasn't on set. I didn't suffer through the same trauma. So I don't know, what shot achieved this, or what was shot that way, So that's the great part about working with a director, is that they can fill you in on that and say like, oh, well, actually, this would be a great example because we shot it in, on virtual production, or, whatever it was, right? And then it's your job to then sell that, or to make that match with the brief.
Right. Yeah. And unfortunately, I feel like sometimes right now it is what we talked a little about earlier, but it's like, okay, we've got to get this reel in by 5:00 tonight. Can we submit you? And it just feels like a mad dash, right? And you're just throwing a reel into like what is just like a pile of like 100 fucking directors, and it's kind of like, we're just glad we got asked. Let's just throw it in, like it kind of feels just like a crapshoot so much versus like really trying to like strategize, right? And like relationship build with not only me as a director with the producer, and be like, okay, how can we really win this? And how can we stand out? Right. Or even like when I was at my old production company, we would really work with the client and figure out like the ask, and work with the ask of like, okay, like maybe we can position ourselves this way. We also had a fabrication company. So it was like, we can also like put in our treatment, look, we can build all these sets in house, or there's this crazy ask of like some build, like we can handle that here, or maybe we have a great location, we can kind of like throw that to them, and kind of like, even if it's not like we're not in the bidding process, we can be like, hey, thanks for the ask. Here's who we're putting up for it. And by the way, like here's actually, we've already like think we have the perfect locations for this job or whatever, and send those, and really try to strategize better versus just like, well, let's send 3 directors and maybe we'll get it, fingers crossed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that, just sort of generally speaking, I think we're at a moment in the industry where a lot of that, spray and pray, those companies are struggling. They're having a hard time, and so naturally the ecosystem, the sort of like Darwinism of the industry, will mean that I think we do start pitching on projects more intentionally, but also, my hope is that we end up with a better industry, outside of that. And that comes from things like pitch reform and, more communication.
Yep, absolutely. Well, let's, if you want to stop sharing here, yeah, let's jump into the lightning round here. So really quick, and I know you have a lot of directors that so I don't want to put you on the spot, but like right now, who's inspiring you as a director?
So I have a general answer, and I have a specific answer. General answer is directors who are willing and able to evolve with the industry. So there's a director that we've worked with for a long time, Nick Sawyer, as a tabletop director. At every step of the last 10, 11 years that I've worked with him, he's always stayed ahead. He's always looked at what everyone else is doing. He's like fiercely aware of what his competition are doing, fiercely aware of what the briefs are saying, and he always manages to stay ahead, goes away, shoots a spec. Those references come in, he has that work ready. It's, it's just fiercely evolving constantly. So directors who are sort of business savvy, who understand that they have to treat themselves like a business, they have to look at, well, what if I just reach out directly to the brand? There's a gap in the industry. There's a problem with the industry as it is. Let me be the solution to that. Those sort of directors are really directors that I admire. I admire poor Mike Medaway, who I haven't been, I haven't let him take a holiday in a while because he's been so busy. just because he is, every project he does, he seems to come away with something that is so dynamic and exciting, even when he's put in, conditions that don't necessarily reflect that. His ability to, again, adapt and stay calm and always get the best out of a project is, I think, really admirable.
That's great. So what inspires you outside of, owning and operating equals management?
I listen to a lot of music throughout my life. It's always sort of been a key part of who I am. I'm a former Radiohead groupie. I followed them across Europe. Got 2 tickets in the next 2 months to see them again, so I'm thrilled. But I find that my life without music, and the periods I've gone, even long stretches without listening to music, they're just not as colorful or as exciting. And now I have a 20-month old daughter who is, she inspires me, and seeing her sort of learn and grow and react, even when I'm playing music to her, and being very controlling on what she listens to, and I find that really exciting and inspiring.
And then what tool can you not live without right now? Something that just has made your life way easier.
Oh, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that sense. I mean, I can't live without pen and paper. Just a notebook and a pen, just constantly. There was a long period where I couldn't afford to get on a train, so I'd be on a bus, and I'd have my iPod and a notebook and a pen, and I'd be more than happy to sit for hours and hours and hours. But I mean, now really, I find ChatGPT so exciting and so wonderful, because I find that the more I give it, the more sort of thoughtful I am with it, the more conversational I am with it, the more it's helping me maybe identify the gaps in my knowledge and in my work, but also constantly trying to improve things for for directors. And I find that conversational side of it, that sort of brainstorming, is amazing.
All right, so we have every guest leaves a question for the next guest, tradition we do here. So the question that was left for you is, if there is something you could change or tell yourself from early on in your career, what would it be?
I think one of the big mistakes that I've made is sometimes I've been too proud about the way that I work, and I haven't. What do I mean by that? I suppose I mean, we work with directors internationally, and so typically that means that we represent them in every territory, outside of their home territory. And there have been some directors that then have started, speaking with a production company in Spain or wherever, and I've gotten jealous, and I've had that sort of human pang of like, I know I'm doing my best for you. I know I'm pushing really hard for you. Every day I'm trying to do everything. And so there's this feeling of like, well, you're cheating on me, which is rubbish. It's not true at all. But I've been guilty in the past of not looking at the bigger picture and being too proud and sort of saying like, okay, well, I suppose I've tried to keep directors. I've not seen that directors need to make their own decisions, even if they're bad decisions. And and I suppose that's helped me grow as a father as well. It's hard. It's an intensely emotional relationship that you end up with when you're representing talent in the way that I do. And there's a few directors that have left, and it's been heartbreaking. And because more often than not, I've told them, like, I don't think this is the right decision, and in a few cases that was right, but you have to learn to let go and not be too proud, and try to think about the cycle of how it talent is constantly evolving and growing and coming up.
Yep. All right, and then it's your turn now. So if you'll leave a question for the next guest.
So my question is, if you treated your career like a business, what is the first investment that you would make?
I love that. It's really good. Well, awesome, Scott. I really appreciate you coming on the show and like all the conversations we had leading up to the show. It's been awesome, and this has been super inspirational and I think going to be super valuable for everybody. So thank you so much for your time. I also want to thank Adrian for being willing to put his work out there. But where can people find you? What are your socials, website?
So the best place to find us is on www.equalsmgmt.com. Similarly, our Instagram page, which is quite active, and we're constantly posting on pitch reform. The Instagram page is just equalsmgmt. That's the only problem with the Instagram page is there's like 3 or 4 people that use it. So you never know who's read the message, who's replying to the message, but I try to stay on top of it.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Scott, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks a lot. Speak soon.
All right, that does it for another show. Thanks for watching the Commercial Directors Podcast, and please subscribe to the show on any of the platforms where you listen to your podcast and on YouTube. YouTube's a great place where you can actually watch the breakdown, so make sure you subscribe. Also, give us a follow on the gram at the Commercial Directors Pod. And please DM us there. We would love to hear from you on potential guests you'd like on the show and what topics you want to learn more about. Or you can email me at evan@swinehartco.com, and that's SWINEHARTCO.com.